I need some traction. You need some traction.
But hey everyone, Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder at Boast AI and Traction. Today's webinar is brought to you by Boast AI Launch Academy in partnership with BCF Ventures, Founder Institute, Lazaridis Institute, and Growth Blazers. Excited for this topic because not a lot of us talk about it, but your finances are the fundamentals to your growth. And if you run out of money, you have no business, but not a lot of founders focus on it. And have a great friend and partner here, David, CPA, founder of Dashboard Financial. He got to know David through our investors at Radian Capital, and he's helped a lot of companies that I know and built over 100 finance departments for high growth companies, many of which have turned into unicorns like Paxos, Milk Bar, Hyperscience. And prior to Dashboard, David worked in private equity, public accounting, and was a successful entrepreneur. You know, a lot of founders, what they do is they ignore finances or they ignore bringing on a CFO or a fractional CFO, and it just creates a lot of pain, especially when you're fundraising. You know, the goal of a CFO or fractional CFO, basically a head of finance, is to help you come up with the path to the vision you've laid out with numbers. Right? It's not about doing your P&L and closing your books and your year-end statements and all of that. I mean, anyone can do that. There's lots of people who do that. But really the goal of a head of finance is to help you as a founder. You've laid that vision out. How do I get there? What's the most optimal path to get to my vision? Or maybe, you know, it's the wrong vision here, but what's the most optimal path to get to the vision with numbers, and helping you paint that story to potential exec hires, to potential investors, financiers, and so on. So without further ado, Dave, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Appreciate the intro, Lloyd. As Lloyd said, I'm a CFO, but it's a bit different than your fractional CFO firm. Name of my firm is Dashboard Financial. Lloyd gave you a bit of a background on me. I'll start off just by talking a little bit about typical projects I work on. I'm not going to talk too much about my firm, but a typical fractional CFO, you know, when you think about it, it's like, oh, what are you doing? You're helping us with your fundraise. Are you helping us build a financial model? Are you keeping the books? Are you approving bills? Are you making my life easier? What are you actually doing? It really depends on the stage and size of the company. With my companies I work with, I work everywhere from Series Seed to about Series B. So that's typically you raise, and typically when I come in to a Series Seed, it's right before the Series A. So it'd be, you know, maybe you raise $2-3 million, and you in the next 3-4 months you're planning on raising a Series A, which right now is probably about $8-12 million, all the way up to you've raised, you know, $200 million, and you need different types of work. So, you know, as Lloyd said, I work with a lot of different types of clients. Here are just a few that come to mind. In the last year, 6 of my clients have become unicorns, which is a lot different than past years. I would say on average, I take on about 25 clients a year. And, you know, they basically mostly need to transition. So when you start off as a company, you're mostly looking at, okay, do I have a product? Where am I in the cycle? But once you get to the point where you're, you know, a Series Seed and you're going up for the Series A, people start asking tougher questions, and that's when finance starts to matter. And I'll come in and I'll kind of help guide everyone and build out the finance team and put in proper procedures and policies and everything that you need to be standalone. So instead of a regular typical CFO, fractional CFO that comes in and they say, I want to own this client as long as possible. I want to be with you for the next 10 years. I typically come in a little bit later stage and say, just do it yourself. My projects are typically 3 months to a year, and it'll involve basically getting you ready to stand on your own 2 feet. So if you want someone that's going to approve bills or, you know, just do basic work, that's not what Dashboard does. What we do is kind of get you ready for that next level. Or if you made a mistake and, you know, you've hired a 4-person finance team and you realize you need to redo the finance team, the structure's not right. Maybe you hired someone with only investment banking experience to be your VP of finance and you have no accountants. we can restructure your finance department. We can help you get through audits, basically anything you need, financial models to get you to stand on your own 2 feet and get you the money raised. So the question I often get asked is, when does finance actually matter? Really good question, because at the beginning, it doesn't. So if you're 2 guys in a garage or WeWork or out of your apartment, no one cares about money. Well, they care about money, but they don't care about finance. They don't care about, are you keeping the books? Do you have a model? Typically, if you're a tech company, all that matters is if your business works. Can you get customers? Can you prove an MVP? That's all anyone really cares about. At the beginning, people might say to you, oh, you need this for finance, you need this system, you need to track your books and everything. And I would typically say, if you're really small, just worry about burn and hanging on to money. Don't worry about actually, going out there and having picture perfect books and accrual accounting and doing everything. That will come with time. And in my experience, investors don't care. A lot of times when I meet with investors, with clients, everyone gets really rattled where they say, oh, I thought that I needed perfect books and I needed all these KPIs and the perfect financial dashboard and like accrual-based accounting, and they're going to check my cap table. No one's going to do that. They want to see, at the early stages at least, that your numbers work. And as you go up the chain, Series A, Series B, Series C, that's when they start looking for that stuff. Ultimately, you'll need to get an audit from a Big Four firm. That's later on if you're Series D, Series C, and you're looking to go public. But at the beginning, all they care about is that the product works. So don't stress about finance. You can have some basic bookkeeping. Don't spend a lot of money on, hiring internal people. A lot of times, some company startups, if they're seed or before, they'll have someone that's, a VP of finance. You don't need a VP of finance until you're post Series A. And then sometimes till you're Series B. You can get by with a controller for a really long time. I've seen companies raise hundreds of millions of dollars with just a controller. So if they're a strong controller, and so people know a controller is basically the head of accounting. So you have good books, but you might not have, the sexy VP of finance with all the, like a Harvard MBA that worked at Blackstone and Carlyle, or, some Sequoia, doing fancy finance stuff. Really, again, to focus when you're young, focus on building your product, building your operations team, getting a tech team. Don't waste stock options and hiring finance people until, you're later on. Focus on getting, the executive team that makes sense. Let's assume that, you have a product, everything's going well, you've raised, let's call it $2.5 million in your seed, you're doing 80,000 a month in revenue, it's a SaaS business, super sexy, and VCs are starting to say, hey, I want to give you money. Again, don't worry about it. The diligence stage is going to be really easy. I've seen it happen so many times where people are like, oh, I'm nervous. What if they don't like our numbers? What if we, when we started off, the entities weren't structured right, or we didn't record revenue right, we recorded on a cash basis for part of it, and then we recorded it on accrual basis under a different section. And just so everyone knows the difference, cash basis means money in the door. So that means, let's say I sold a year-long contract for $12,000, and I got it all paid up front. Cash basis means you record all your revenue up front, and you record 12,000 on your books. You have 12,000 in revenue. That's not correct. It's you record 1,000 a month for 12 months. So depending on when the period is you're showing them, you might have billings for $12,000, but you don't have revenue of 12,000. And that goes into ARR versus MRR. Getting back to the diligence stage, it just doesn't matter. For the Series A, really focus on your tech. The finance questions they're going to ask you are going to be about they want to see some contracts. They're going to want to see human resources stuff like employee contracts. They're going to want to see your cap table. They're going to want to see your accounts receivable to make sure you're collecting money. A lot of times companies don't actually collect the money that they bill for. So I've seen it where companies are doing $10 million a year in ARR, but they might have only collected 3 million of it. So they never had any system. From an operational standpoint, you really do want to make sure accounts receivable are taken care of and that you are collecting money, because finance does matter at the seed stage when you're talking about burn. And I'll get into that after. Coming back to the slide, when does finance matter? It really matters when you start getting due diligence requests, when people start asking you for a fundraising model, an annual budget. I kind of talked briefly about due diligence requests. A fundraising model is different than an annual budget. An annual budget is what you give the board that'll show realistic burn. So when you do a fundraising model, you really want to see something 3 to 5 years out. It's all made up. It's 100% fiction. I've never seen one person hit their fundraising model in the history of me doing this, and I've worked with about 150 companies. Typically, every company I've ever worked with has shown 100 million in ARR in year 5. Always happens. So I'll get into financial modeling a little later, but that's kind of like dream big on the fundraising model. On the annual budget, you have to be very, very conservative. That's the model that's going to show how much cash burn you have. And just to give you some numbers, I would say 95% of the companies I work with lose money. And that's anyone who's worked in the startup world. There's no profits at the beginning stage. VCs don't expect it. Investors don't expect it. Worry about, getting customers and proving the concept. So an annual budget will monitor how much money you're actually earning on a net basis, and basically predict the runway. And the runway is how many months you have until you have to raise your next round. So typically, it's about 12 to 18 months I've seen when someone raises a Series A or something like that, or a seed. It depends. Most people claim they're going to do it for 18 months, but the reality is you end up hiring people, want big time upfront expenses. A lot of times when you raise that round, you owe people a lot of money. So in the prior round, a lot of times people run out of money, or firms run out of money and they don't have much left. They end up building up these balances. You see it quite a bit with law firms. So you might owe your law firm $100,000. You might owe your marketing people, your consultant, $100,000. You might owe digital agency $200,000. And when you raise your, Series A and you get $8 million, you have to give that $500,000 for back payments as well. So that's something that the annual budget will take into effect as well. Tax compliance and credits. This is something that's important. R&D tax credit, Boast has a great service on that. Something to definitely look at. It's, I usually say it's about 7% of your total tech spend, but, like Lloyd's firm can give you a better idea on that. It's something, and then along the lines, that's free money. Just to confirm on that, that's free money. When you look at tax returns, very easy. Most, at the beginning, don't spend $10,000 to prepare your tax return. Anyone can do it. As you level up and you get bigger, you'll need a bigger firm because, the annual tax return is going to get more complex. You're going to have more states. But at the beginning, don't worry about it. Audited financials, something you really shouldn't worry about at the seed or Series A. By default language, most Series A documents will tell you that you need to have audited financials every year within 90 to 180 days after the year end. Don't worry about it. I've never seen a board say no, that you actually have to do that. You have to get a waiver from the board. So if you are negotiating your agreement for your Series A, you can ask that to be removed. But if they don't remove it, your board will typically give you a waiver on that. So very rarely do companies at the Series A stage get audits. It's way too much work. The exception for that would be someone that's taking on a large amount of debt or is a fintech. So if you are working with if you're a fintech working with investment banks or big insurance companies, they're going to want an audit to make sure that you're financially stable. And it's just a check the box. These companies, large, $100 billion companies have a checklist to make sure that you're not a fly-by-night company. So if they're going to do a pilot with you, they want to make sure typically that you're a real company, and the audit is one of the items on the checklist. You can get out of it, but it's not that easy, and it doesn't make you look great. Again, I would try and get out of an audit if you can, pre-Series B. Monthly reporting and KPIs, financials. Anyone who has a company knows what they're asking for here. It's going to be a lot of investors have rights. Monthly financials, profit and loss statement, a balance sheet that shows your cash, KPIs. If you're a SaaS company, that could be customer acquisition costs, But really the main item is going to be burn a lot of times, that, pre-Series B, that people are going to be looking at. And board decks, just typical slides people are looking for. That's something where a finance professional can help as well. And those are a list of investor demands. On the employee side, what you're going to be looking for when people start, they typically use like a PEO, like a Trinet, and get, or they're using Gusto or, an ADP sometimes. And it's just very simple payroll and typically there's no benefits. Startups typically employ younger people. So not some people could be on their parents' plan. Some people pay it for themselves, but I would say pre-series seed, people do not typically receive benefits. After Series A, everyone receives benefits. So again, when you have to start growing up, stock options as well. Typically, you have to do this across the board, but you have to really cement it once you get to a Series A. Most companies on the stock option side put aside about 8 to 15%, for the Series A, and it could go up as dilution occurs. But to keep in mind that stock options are necessary. So I would talk, stock options are a really big conversation because it's a way to give, everyone's getting paid under market at startups. No one makes what they'd be worth if they worked at the, equivalent Google or Facebook. There's websites that kind of estimate stock options, but I would try and talk to different founders that, or someone like myself that can kind of guide you on what's fair for stock options at different stages. I've come into and seen cap tables where they've given out huge stock options to people that, probably shouldn't have gotten it at that level because they just decided that's what they thought was fair. But as you, start off with a company, stock options don't really matter. You need people to work there and you need good people that are motivated. So there's a turning point in each round where the stock options go down. So if you're a series, if you're a seed company, the stock options are going to be very high, or pre-seed even, because you want people to join your company and no one's going to do it for under half a point. But if you're not going to give the same person the same level of half a point after you've raised $20 million. You might give them a 100th of a point or a 200th of a point for a new employee at the same title. It really runs the gamut. So talk to venture capitalists that have funded you, talk to other people in industry to determine what's right on that. Policies, another great thing that no one likes. When you think about policies, engineers hate policies. So I've seen companies just say, screw it, we're not doing policies. We don't want, for credit cards and expense reimbursement, they're not going to follow it. People come to startups because they don't like the bureaucracy. But there is value in having some policies. I would say accounts receivable to me is the most important policy, especially at the early stages when you don't have $50 million in the bank, because you need to make sure you collect money. So a lot of companies, they start off and it's the founder and the COO that are collecting the money. And they, typically they get the money. They know the people they sold to. But then once they start growing, they start hiring people and they start hiring salespeople that worked from bigger companies. They might have never collected. So you end up not collecting any money and you're showing this great MRR, monthly recurring revenue, but none of it's hitting the bank. And, you have to actually chase people. So what I've had successful with in policies is, writing something down. What happens if they don't pay? When do you send them reminder emails? What happens if they don't pay 10 days after? What happens if they don't pay a month after? What happens if they don't pay 2 months after? When do you cut them off? What if they go dark on you, the client, and they don't respond to your emails? How do you get the money from them? So I would say accounts receivable, if I were to do one policy, would be it. Expense reimbursement, those are usually pretty simple. Like, what are you allowed? Everyone's had one of those at some company they've worked for. Credit cards, there's a lot of, whether it's Brex or you're using Chase, there's a lot of options with credit cards. And, you just want to say, if you're giving someone, basically a limitless credit card where they can, that they only use it for certain items. So you can spell that out in the policy. When COVID, travel, travel isn't really a big deal, but it will come back. So I would say, with travel policies, what kind of hotels are they allowed to stay at? What's their budget? Can they use Uber? Is there a budget on Uber if it's triple surge? Like, do you have to check Lyft? It depends. Like, people don't usually go too crazy with this, but I've seen people take advantage of it, especially at the enterprise level, when someone's doing sales and they're going to Singapore or Tokyo. Those bills can easily go up to 20, 30,000 a trip. Getting ready for a fundraiser acquisition, I touched briefly, not really caring that much about your finances before a fundraise. That's obviously different when you get into an acquisition. But when you're going for a fundraise, and this is typical up to a Series A. After a Series A, it's more similar to the acquisition side, where people are investing. A Series B is typically at least $20 million now. Usually quite a bit more. If you're a hot fintech, it could be $100 million Series B. When I talk about this stuff not mattering, what I'm talking about more is Series A seed. They're investing in you because of you and not because of your finances. So most founders have some charisma to them, and they are able to explain their product clearly. They have a good deck, they have a good founding team, and they should have the background to at some point build software or a product that works. They don't care if you did $8,000 a month or $6,000 a month. That's typically only a few clients. Same thing with users. If you're off by a little, don't stress about it. No one really cares. What they care about is that you're the right team to do this, and someone is using it and someone likes your product. It doesn't have to be so exact. Valuation can be anything. As I said, it depends on the founding team, your technology. Doesn't really matter for historicals. In the last year, taking out, going back, many years, I started doing this in 2014, working with startups, and it was totally different. The valuations, a SaaS company could be 8 times revenue, and that people thought that was a lot. Now, no one cares. Now people will pay 40 times revenue, and they won't care. Evaluations are really anything. It depends, and sometimes if you have nothing, and you saw this a bit in the public markets, some of the SPACs that came out that didn't have any revenue, but they were big ideas like space travel, electric vehicles. So if it's a big scalable idea and you have a great team, you're almost better not to have, the numbers won't matter as much. The valuation is, what's your addressable market? What's your total addressable market? Can you pull it off? Is it reasonable that you would get there? Valuation for a company that's e-commerce is much more simple. It's much easier to, e-commerce is as close as we have to retail. So something like that would be pretty easy to value because we have enough of those success stories. Some of these companies that scale very quickly that are big disruptors, big Uber or something like that, you could value them anything you want because they could be, moonshots. Going on, diligence depends more on the stage and the size of the round. I talked about this briefly. Diligence, how intense it is. If it's, Series A from a VC, it's going to be completely painless. There's no way, no one should be intimidated by it. No one should say, oh, but they're going to ask this. They're not going to care. If they like you and they like your business, they'll invest. The numbers will not matter. And you'll get through diligence, no problem. And what I'm seeing now is the amount of term sheets companies are getting right now compared to a couple of years ago. There are companies that I worked with recently that, I don't think they would have gotten around a Series A, and now I'm seeing, a half dozen term sheets come in. It's a good time to be fundraising if you have a business that needs fundraising. So the size of the round, I'm sure everyone's seen it. The rounds are getting bigger. Used to be, $6-7 million Series A. Now they're going up to about 15 for Series A. Same thing with Series B. 15 to 20 was, pretty standard. Now I'm seeing, 50, 100 million for a Series B. It just depends. So, and the VC, there's a lot more VC firms are getting a lot more competitive. So typically, the later the stage, the bigger the round, the tougher the due diligence. In this case, with the amount of competitiveness going on in fundraising for hot companies, that will not be the case. If you're not a hot company, it will still be the case. And another thing to add on the fundraising side, I've seen, as good as it is for these hot young companies, I've seen the opposite happen for, companies that have been around a little that maybe don't have the hockey stick growth. They are not getting funding at all. They're being left for dead. I guess you got to go for it with these companies. When you have a startup, people don't want to see, 20, 30% growth. They want to see hockey stick growth, 20% a month, 30% a month, 100% a month, so you really have to, the market is hot, but only for certain companies. So actually talking about the finance side of Diligence, they're going to be looking for basic financials, monthly financials, tax returns, financial model, a cap table, all your old incorporation documents like that you don't know where they are, insurance documents, make sure you have, cyber insurance, directors and officers insurance, proper liability. They're going to look at, make sure no one's suing you, legal stuff. They're going to ask for confirmation from your attorney, and they take care of all that stuff. Copies of contracts, so your sales team probably has that pretty easy. IP, which again, and trademark, stuff like that, that'll go under the legal. Executive agreements, they want to see, how did you, when you started the company, what kind of, can you be fired? What kind of shares do you have? What level shares on voting? Can they kick you off the board? Not that they're going to, the board, the investor, but it's always an option. The most important thing is whether the story lines up. If you say in your deck, you have 90% gross margins, your financials show 70% gross margins, and your financial model shows 62% in gross margins, it doesn't make any sense. So people lose a lot. It's like anything else. People lose a lot of faith in you if your story doesn't match what's actually going on. Similarly for an acquisition, but it's like 1,000 times harder. I put 10. It's a lot harder than that. When you're dealing with an acquisition, you're dealing with older. Let's just assume it's a corporate acquisition, a very large corporation. It's a lot of legal. It's a bit of it's a good amount of finance also. Usually, figure out. I would say it's typically 3 to 6 months from when you start the acquisition process. They really go through everything. There's going to be literally hundreds of requests, but these are typically $100 million plus acquisitions. It's really tough. So you're going to need whether it's a firm like myself. Hopefully you're big enough at that point that you have a VP of finance. But if you're not big enough, that means you don't have, you got a lot more equity and you didn't get diluted. So even better. And you can hire someone to help with the diligence. And like I said, the lawyers do a lot of the work and the contract. And I'll also mention that, when you fundraise or you sell the company, it's not always all up front. So when you see these numbers where someone raised $25 million, that could be in tranches. They get 10 million up front and they get the last 15 if they hit so-and-so KPIs, like the revenue hits XYZ. Similarly, for acquisitions, I see a lot of times, acqui-hires being made and that everyone doesn't know, and they say, oh, you got acquired by this company, congratulations, but they're not really acquired for that. Similarly, for some of these large companies, you see they got acquired for $1 billion. Doesn't always mean they got $1 billion. They might have gotten, 300 million, which is great. But then you have to pay out all the investors, and then you have to earn out the rest of it. Usually it's headline. They like the big numbers for headline, but the numbers you see aren't always as they appear. I'd say they're usually much smaller. Similar with IPOs, usually people only sell a small amount of the company on an IPO. The rest of it is being held by the owner. So you do have a market for the stock, but just because the founder of Google has $80 billion worth of stock doesn't mean that they can actually sell all that stock. That's similar for smaller startups. And as we know, startup founders that have raised $10 million out of $50 million valuation, and they own 60% of the company, doesn't necessarily mean that they actually have that as a net worth. It's a very illiquid asset. But I will say that people do start taking money out. Founders can take money out of the companies starting in Series B and Series C. Talk a little bit about a financial model. Does anyone really care? And I say this like half joking. I talked a little bit about a budget and a model. A budget is actually like, people care about a budget. Like your board's going to want to sign off on a budget every year. And this is, again, I'm talking post Series A, pre-Series A, just do what you got to do and keep the lights on. Don't spend all your money until you get to the Series A. But once you get to a Series A, a budget people really care about. they want to make sure that you're not going to run out of money and that you could actually, hit your goals so you can get to a Series B, or the company is going to be desirable enough for an acquisition, which is pretty rare in a Series A. A model is really what gets people excited. The thing about a model is they're different for each type of investor. So if you're doing like a friends and family round and like you're pitching your cousin, they're gonna, call BS on your model. They're not gonna believe the numbers. They're gonna be like $100 million, really? I don't think so. And it's not meant for them. Like the valuations aren't meant. Why would a company that's doing $1 million a year in revenue be worth $60 million? It doesn't make sense to, just a regular person. It really, the models that we're making are really meant for investors that specialize in tech investing that really want to see the opportunity. How would you get there? Have you thought about the headcount needed? The numbers themselves aren't actually that important. And again, similar to fundraising, it depends on the size and stage of the round. So if you're going Series A, seed, just moonshot. Whatever you got to do, show huge numbers. I would hire someone to help you that isn't your friend that's a former investment banker, because they do very different models than startups. There is something to be said for someone that can do a model that's worked with VCs, that's gotten people funding. Simpler is usually better at the earlier stage, seed and Series A, because everyone wants to understand it. And as you get more complex, very few people will be able to understand your financial model. Like I said, the earlier, keep it simple. People just want to see that, it can scale. As you get later on, Series B, Series C, these things actually have to be somewhat realistic. By then, you're going to have an internal VP of finance. You might even have a couple of financial analysts that can help you build this properly. And I would say, as you go on, you want to be more, a little bit more conservative. You're not going to be showing, oh, we're going to be doing and if people remember WeWork a few years ago, that was one thing they were really good at. They basically showed SoftBank this huge opportunity that we're going to own the world. We're going to be the world's first $1 trillion company at the time. They did it really early after like Series A, Series B, and people bought the story. That's one way to dream big. Obviously that didn't work out, but they did get the funding. So that worked out. What are they looking for on a financial model? Again, as I said, it depends on the size and the stage. If you're asking for a lot of money and you're talking to a private equity investor, they're going to be pretty tough. Series D, Series E, Series C, private equity investors, they are going to be really tough on your model. VCs, Series A, they don't care. They just, they're not going to ask hard questions, really. Very few. Likewise, if you're pitching your cousin, they might ask hard questions and it might not be worth the hassle, so don't worry about it. So again, I talked about, does the story line up? If you're an e-commerce company with 90% margins, that doesn't really make any sense. There's no way. How can you manufacture something? Are you shipping from China? Are you drop shipping it? Doesn't make any sense. If you're a SaaS company with 40% margins, that also doesn't make any sense. So, SaaS companies want to be 70, 80% margin. Think about, does the story line up? And at the beginning, I'm focusing on gross margin because that's all anyone really cares about. Don't blow all your money and burn through it. But really, do you have a scalable business? As you grow from doing, $1 million a year to $100 million a year, does that gross margin stay the same? Because everyone knows you have a corporate team and you could have 50 people on your corporate team, and that's a big expense. But what is that? That should stay constant. You shouldn't need that many more people on your corporate team as you grow. Cash burn over a specific period of time, if it's 12, 18 months, think about the story. If I'm saying I need $10, $20 million, but I'm showing that I'm making a profit of $1 million a month in month 6, you did your model too aggressively. So let the story come to you and let it line up. If you're saying, okay, I need $10 million in 18 months. Are you profitable in 18 months? Are you still going to be burning money? How much cash do you want to have at the end of 18 months? Do you want to have $1 million, 500,000? Do you want to say, so make sure the story lines up on the cash burn. A lot of times people are like, oh, this is what our revenue is going to be. It's going to be, 5 million a month. But then you got 20 million in the bank and you don't actually need the 10 million you're asking for. You only need like 500,000 to get there. So make sure the story lines up on the cash burn. Are the founders thinking big? I've covered this. You really want to just, moonshot on a financial model. Really go for it. Make sure everything, in the later years looks amazing. And you see this again with the SPACs. SPACs, the special purpose vehicles that are very popular on Wall Street now. they're doing 5-year models where companies are doing 0 revenue for years 1 through 3 and doing $20 billion a year in revenue in years 4 and 5. So, you can do this stuff. There's no rules against it, but people do want to see that you're thinking big. Chart of accounts. This is a simple thing I'll talk about briefly. I can go into it later if we have time. But make sure the chart of accounts, which basically is your categories. So is it like administration expenses, technology expenses, sales and marketing, compensation? Make sure they line up on the financials that you present someone, and also on the financial model, and also on the budget. A lot of times people have financial models that show all these weird categories for expenses, and then they show the real expenses on the budget, and then totally different expenses on the financial statements. So you want to make sure the story lines up between the 3 different documents. How many years do you want to go out? I've talked about this before. Every model shows the 100 million in year 5. So usually 3 to 5 makes sense. Some investors like 3, some like 5. I'd focus on years 1, 2, and 3 and making them pretty tight. And then years 4 and 5 go for the moonshot. Yeah, so overall, does anyone care? Maybe in the later stage. They do in the later stages. They don't in the early stages. It's just a check the box. Common mistakes, cash doesn't equal revenue. Because you closed a $100,000 contract doesn't mean you have $100,000. That could, unless it's payable 100% upfront. So just be careful of that, as you close deals, that you don't say, okay, we're good on money. That's again why we need the budget. And you need someone watching the bank account closely. Taxes, don't worry about sales tax that early unless you're an e-commerce company. Sales tax, there's certain states that require it for SaaS products and a lot of the tech products, but some are exempt. Most of the time people just say, screw it, I will figure it out once I get, $10, $20 million, and then I'll start charging sales tax. And if I owe $50,000 in back taxes, so be it. One thing to keep in mind is that does pierce the corporate veil. So if you don't make it to Series A and you have $50,000 sales tax that you should have paid, the government can come after you personally. Not taking the R&D tax credit, free money. Both, again, talk to Lloyd or someone there. It's free money. Just take it. Could be hundreds of that. I think it's up to about $250,000 refundable to you. So it helps with the burn, and it's not that hard to do. Not using the right software. I'll get into this on the next slide, but typically everyone, don't go crazy spending a ton of money on accounting software. Overestimating revenue and underestimating expenses. Again, that's great for a model, for a budget, but not for a model. Don't rely on someone with no accounting experience. Just because someone worked at an investment bank and says they know finance or they're an MBA doesn't mean they know anything about accounting. Don't overcomplicate the financial model. I talked about that. Chart of accounts I've talked about. Best practices, seed company, keep it simple, outsource your bookkeeping, budget to manage your burn. Everyone's basically using the same systems: QuickBooks, Expensify for expense reimbursement, Bill.com for accounts payable, Carta for cap table, and a PEO like TriNet or JustWorks to manage payroll, or Gusto. They're not PEO, but they're great. And then basically always think about how you're going to get to the revenue needed for a Series A. Very important. You're not going to get the money for the Series A unless you have revenue, because that's all anyone cares about. Revenue and gross margins. No one cares about, whether or not your insurance expense was 10% higher than anyone else. Series A, I focus on, this is where I start thinking about bringing the finance in-house, hire a controller or VP of finance. Don't spend a lot of money on big projects like NetSuites or audits until you need them. Every venture capitalist loves talking about NetSuite. They love it, but it's a real pain to implement. It's like $50,000 to implement, and it's basically just a fancy QuickBooks at the beginning. Series B, at this point, you got to clean up everything. So you need a full finance team. You need the controller, VP of finance, you need senior accountant, you need bookkeepers, everything's in-house. Get an audit, clean up everything like sales tax issues, everything that you might have had a problem with. Make sure everything's buttoned up, because at this point, you might have serious people looking to buy your firm or give you $100 million as an investment. Budget to manage the burn and hold management responsible. At this point, usually at the beginning stages on a budget, you're going to have the COO and CEO doing, like, kind of overseeing the budget, or the controller. Once you get deeper in Series A, Series B, you need each manager, like the head of sales and the head of growth, customer success. They all need to have their own headcounts and tell you what softwares they need. Chart of accounts. I talked about this a little bit, and I just want to give an example. I know we have about 15 minutes left, so Lloyd, interrupt me if you want to. The main point is this is a kind of what a chart of accounts should look like. This is what I said, compensation, break it out, marketing, break it out, office in general, professional fees, software and technology, travel and entertainment. And you can even separate compensation by department. I wouldn't do it at the early stages, but you can do it whenever, basically anytime you can. You're going to need to do it for budgeting and forecasting. So again, this should be done consistently. This is once you pick your chart of accounts for your budget, make it match your model and make it match your budget and your financial statements.
Fantastic. There's a whole bunch of questions here. What about contracts and legal? Does that fall into finance and CFO world? How about employees, NDAs, IP protection, all those kinds of things?
So it depends. Again, at the beginning stages, if you're like 3 people, you could ask your CFO, but really that's a legal item. So anytime you have NDAs, like usually what people do is they'll hire, there's a few firms that specialize in startup finance. You're going to have Gunderson, Cooley, Lowenstein, Wilson Sonsini, and then they're too expensive for those things. So usually you just want like an outsourced general counsel, someone cheap that's charging like, $200-300 an hour that can kind of knock out some of these simple items for you. But an outsourced CFO can guide you on that.
Now, Stephanie asks here, you said they care more about the story than the historical numbers, but then you said you want to show huge month-on-month revenue growth to invest. How do you differentiate? So I want to say one sentence here that you want to share a story backed by numbers, right? It's like saying like vision without action is a daydream and action without vision is a nightmare. Like anytime if you share a story that's not backed by numbers, then is that vaporware or is that real, right? So that's where the CFO or head of finance marriage with the founder works really well. Is like, that's my big vision. What's the story? How can I have the story, but it can't be anecdotal. What is the numbers that's painting that picture? But what's your answer there? Like, how do you differentiate these two stances?
Yeah, anytime with numbers, anyone who's like a CFO or good with numbers, you can spin them any way you want. So instead of focusing on revenue, you could focus on users. So clearly, if you don't have any users and you don't have any pilots and you're saying we're going to the moon, you have to show how you're going to do it. Is it just because you don't have salespeople? But you do need some historical, but you basically focus on whatever was decent and good. Like you must have had something that was good. If you have nothing that's good, it doesn't help. But you have to focus on what's good, and whether that's users or maybe it was enterprise, and then you spin the story, hey, we're only going to focus on enterprise. It's only consumer, do the opposite. So I would focus on the kernels that are good. On the historicals.
Definitely. Give us one example where the kernels were really bad and you had to change it to convey a story that makes it look good.
I've had companies that have gone both into SaaS companies that have gone both consumer and enterprise. So a lot of times consumer is really tough because it compounds. So if it doesn't catch on, it's no good. But they did have a couple of enterprise, if everyone's familiar, SMB is small and medium-sized business. Super enterprise would be like, huge companies, like, billion-dollar companies. So they basically were selling to all 3. So we focused on, and they only had success with the SMB. So we just showed we basically focused on that and said, this is going to be, how we basically grow the business. And then when we actually got the money, we did do some experimenting with both consumer, enterprise, and SMBs. We ended up focusing actually on enterprise, but the SMBs, the success on that was the kernel that brought in the money.
Definitely. No, that's fantastic. I'm trying to field some other questions here to see that's interesting. What is the seed funding size range you're seeing right now for consumer SaaS with large SAM?
It's tough. What round did they ask?
Seed.
Seed, I haven't really seen anything above 5, typically 2 to 4, I'd say, for seed. It really depends on your market. So if it's a sexier with a bigger SAM, then you're probably looking at 3.5.
Awesome. And people are asking here, do you operate in Canada or just the US? I think you're in Toronto right now, right?
Actually, I'm in New York right now. So split my time between Toronto. So I'd say I'm about 50-50 right now.
Well, I think this question, do you operate in Canada, Ray? But I think that the motivation behind that question is, I think you need to find the best resource to help you paint the story around your financials and your vision, um, regardless of where they are, right?
Yeah.
And you might find resources in Canada, you might find resources in the US. I mean, we're living in a distributed world where even us at Boast in December, we were sub 30 people. Now we're 65 people.
Yeah.
And we have, it seems like we have people now in 5 countries, and that is the reality of the situation we're living. Andre asks, some startups lose money for 3 to 5 years as they look for market share users. Does it look realistic to sacrifice margins, revenue streams? Does a strategy like that make sense for B2C?
B2C is tough. I think companies lose. If you look at the public companies, they're losing money for a lot longer than that. So I wouldn't worry about when he says margins. Gross margin, I wouldn't sacrifice too much. If you're looking at net margins and you just have to hire more salespeople, that doesn't matter. I would go for it. I think until companies stop being valued on revenue, the motivation is going to be get the revenue up as much as you can. Because you can figure the other stuff out, but it's hard to get customers. And if it's a good product, people will see with the churn whether or not it's sticky or not.
Definitely. How extensive is the due diligence for a seed stage fundraise these days?
Not very. It really depends. Like seed stage is really connections. How did you get introduced to the person? Is someone vouching for you? What's your background? It depends on if you're, typically with a seed, you're getting a lead. So let's say you're doing a $2.5 million seed. You might get a $2 million lead and then fill it in with angels or friends and family. It's not going to be very, especially on the financial side. It's going to be basically a bet on the CEO and family.
I've seen folks here that have raised multiple rounds and then preempted future rounds with no diligence, like people raising tens of millions into hundreds of millions with a fast process because just the market's been so bonkers, right? And I don't know if there's going to be a better time to raise than right now. So if you have interest, why not entertain it? If you have interest and you truly need the money and you can paint a good story, otherwise everything is a distraction, right? Like typically chase customers and provide value. If you keep chasing funding, you might lose customers. But if the market is really hot right now and you really can't ignore, it's the valuations and the activity is insane. And I have friends who've told me that they've raised a round and their next round was preempted and they were able to close at a much larger valuation. Like, why not do it, kind of thing, right?
Definitely. Series B's at like 3-4 months after Series A's are happening.
What is the biggest and worst pain you've seen during the financial diligence process, where like you took on a customer or worked with a client and was a lot of mess in there, and maybe some learnings for the audience on what not to do?
I'll give a couple scenarios. In one scenario, there were self-dealings where they were, it was like they owned some stuff and the parents owned some stuff, and it was really like they weren't real transactions. They still had like everything else was good, but like the business, for the first, the second year everything was like real. For the first year it wasn't, and I was like, just come clean, like see if they care. If they care, like, and this is with like a tier 1 VC firm, and they didn't care. So I was like, there's no way to explain it. Like, and the CEO was so twisted that they were like, I'm going to ruin everything for this company. I have all these people relying on me. I'm like, don't worry about it. See what happens. Like, you actually did well this year. They might not care. So they restructured the company. Everything worked out. But it was something like that, where most companies have these very weird beginnings before, and things aren't always buttoned up.
And then when investors ask you for financials, typically how far back are we looking?
It depends on the round. So, if it's like a Series B or something, they're going to want like all years. But most companies are pretty young, right? So most companies that are seed are a year or younger, sometimes 2 years. So typically I just give them everything. But 18 months before, 2 years before, I wouldn't really, if you're seed, you don't really need to give them before that. But Series A, I just give, typically by month they want it. If you're 8 years old and you just started going, I would give them like 3 years.
So Alamin asks, you talked about being more pragmatic, putting the Series B model. What are some good rules of thumb you stick to when preparing that? For example, capping headcount to 3x over a year, or revenue not accelerating all of a sudden. Like, what are some considerations there? A lot of companies on here are thinking through like, hey, I'm going to raise my Series B, or what are the metrics investors want to see, and how do you think about putting
So
that?
I would say at the Series A and before, I focus more on revenue, where I think like people have a lot of ideas on revenue. Oh, we're going to go into this. We're going to go into this. We have like these 18 different categories of revenue we're going to go into. So when they're building like the seed or the Series A, sometimes they show like all these categories that like they'll never actually go into. So I think focusing on what you're actually going to go into and your revenue segments. So if you're a company that is doing, government sales and corporate sales, like kind of just come up with those brackets. Like you should know the revenue segment. I think on the headcount, you're going to have each department do the headcount, projections rather than have, the COO and the CEO do it together. So it's just going to be tighter overall. Sales wise, you could back into it based on commissions. So, okay, we need like 8 salespeople. They each have $1 million quota. We're going to bring in $8 million in new business this year, and let's discount that by 25%. Whereas I think before you're like, okay, let's just compound it at 10% a month and see what it ends up at.
This one anonymous attendee asks, is it true that summer is not a good time to fundraise because investors, or is that not the case? So I have this philosophy of ABC, always be selling. Like Boast bootstrap for a long time, and then we closed a 23 million USD Series A, and then did a 100 million credit facility. But in the times that we weren't raising, and even now we're not raising, we've not even spent the money, I always keep my network alive, right? Like always having conversations, because investors, if you view investors like a transaction, if you treat people like a transaction on the way in, they're going to treat you like a transaction on the way out. And then what happens is when you optimize for that kind of investor, the first time a roadblock hits, either you're out of there as a founder or they're out of there as an investor. And I've been a part of 3 venture-backed companies prior to Boast, and I've seen that play out. So the whole thing is, constantly keep your relationships alive. I mean, there's no harm in, you're doing so many things as a founder. Having conversations with investors is not bad, provided they're not invested in competing products, because you get advice from them, you get advice on your pitch, and really like ditch the pitch deck. Just have a conversation. Like we raised all this money with no pitch deck. Like just share the story, align on personal values, align on personal connections. See what you can do for them. Can you make a connection or two for them? Like I did a lot over the years passing deal flow to people. I got to know our investors through our traction community. So those kinds of things, just build a relationship, and over time it'll work out. And honestly, what the network can do for you is unimaginable. So I would say like always be selling in a way, right? You're selling to customers, investors, community members. Is it advised to raise a seed after revenue is achieved? Or I guess let's dive into this real quick because they're at the top of the hour. What are the key metrics you like to advise your companies on for seed, Series A, Series B? And you're like realistic with them. Guys, if we don't hit these, then, let's just not waste our time.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the industry. Let's start with that. So
Yeah,
I think
let's maybe focus on SaaS here, on B2B SaaS.
SaaS, okay, yeah, SaaS is great. So I would say like if you could have 2 enterprise customers that are doing 20,000 a month, then you might be able to you could get a seed pretty easily. It's 2 to 5 million right now. Yeah, I would say that proof of concept and a few paying customers and like some revenue. If you're doing 10, 20,000 a month, that might be all you need to do. But you have to have proof of concept. Series A, I think at least 750 million, kind of like getting close to $1 million. I think you should be able to get a $10 million round, and that's a year. So it could just be based off last month. You did 80,000 last month, something along those lines. When I say $1 million, it doesn't need to be every single month you did 80,000.
Yeah, so you closed the last month with like a 90,000 or so ARR.
No problem. Yeah, no problem. Series B, I would say like at least 5 million, would be kind of, unless you're going for, so there's different, and then also there could be bridge rounds in between, where you don't have, you're not there, so you need to take another million or two. But typically at least 5 million for Series. You do need 5 million for Series B, unless it's something like, you're so enterprise, you're only selling to JP Morgan and, RBC. And like you have one of them, but you don't have the other, so something like that. So that's extreme case.
Well, this is some great advice, and the valuations are bonkers right now. I don't know, I'm seeing like 50 to 40x and everything in between. Especially like if you're in a hot market like note taking or Clubhouse, then it's
Definitely. Yeah, it's crazy. It's a great, as you said, like perfect time to raise. And if you can't raise now, you're not going to be able to raise in 2 years because it is, the hottest I've seen it.
Awesome. That's all we had for today. Dave, how can we reach you?
You can add me on LinkedIn or email me at dave@dashboardfinancial.com. My website's dashboardfinancial.com.
Awesome. That's been a fantastic session today. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful rest of the week.
I need some traction.